Normally, when you ask someone to name communist leaders, most likely they're going to answer you with Stalin, Mao, or the Kim dynasty in North Korea. Sometimes people might say Pol Pot, Tito, or Ho Chi Minh, but one communist leader that is often overlooked is Enver Hoxha, and the ones that do bring him up often just write him off as the crazy lunatic who built a lot of bunkers in Albania. Though that last statement has some truth to it, there's a lot more to the story of Enver Hoxha and the communist Albania than that. In this video, you'll see the life of a man who went from a champion of freedom and reform to the man who would go on to smother those same ideas. Now, before I get into the video, I just want to make a couple of quick disclaimers. One, I'm not Albanian, so there's going to be a lot of mispronunciations of Albanian names in this video. Number two, I'm not a professional at this yet, so if you hear a lot of stuttering, you could just feel free to call me out on it. And number three, there's a lot of little disputed details about this guy's life, so just don't be surprised if you end up looking up this guy and you see a detail that I said that wasn't present on the source that you're looking at. That's probably why. Anyways, on to the video. Enver Hoxha was born on the 16th of October 1908 in the small southern Albanian town of Gjiokaster. Hoxha was the son of a Muslim cloth merchant who, by Albanian standards at the time, was very wealthy. This would mean that Hoxha would have a very comfortable childhood, and with this comfortable childhood, he would also have access to an elementary and high school education, which is something that most Albanian children at the time did not have access to. He would then go on to study French at the French Lycée in Courtier and would eventually get a scholarship to the University of Montpellier in France in 1930. He would then lose his scholarship later because he abandoned his schooling. After this, he would go to Paris and attend parties who were hosted by Paul Villiers-Courtier, sorry for my pronunciation, who was a major French Marxist at the time. It is likely here that he developed his communist and anti-Zoguite beliefs, and the House of Zogu was the ruling Albanian monarchy after World War I. He would then go to Brussels to work in the Albanian consulate in either 1934 or 1935, and while he was in Brussels, he would also study law. He would then turn to Albania in 1936 to once again work at the French Lycée as either a French teacher or the caretaker of the school's library. On the 7th of April 1939, following nearly a decade of Italian economic domination over Albania, Albania was annexed by Fascist Italy. Before the Italian annexation of Albania, the Italians had a major stranglehold over the Albanian economy. This stranglehold had prevented the Albanian government from developing Albania's economy as well as its infrastructure. As well, the Albanian citizenry still had little access to education at all. This would be taken advantage of by both Italy and Hoxha. The Italian government would take advantage of it by using divide and conquer tactics to swiftly conquer Albania. Hoxha would also take advantage of this by spreading his message, and this would become more important in 2 years' time. With the annexation, every aspect of Albania was incorporated to Italy, from its resources to the little infrastructure it had to its military. A fascist collaborator government was set up by the Italians, which was headed by Shefque Verlassi. The Italians had appointed him in the hopes that he would damper anti-Italian sentiments throughout Albania, which did not work as there were strikes and anti-fascist protests in the summer of 1939. Beginning in late 1939, the British would start to albade the various Albanian resistance groups, as they did not want Italy to have the vital entrance to the Adriatic Sea at the time. However, at this time, the Albanian communists were still very disjointed and not united at all, and they would not pose a serious threat to the Italians yet. However, this would be alleviated in a few short years. With Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the leader of the Yugoslav partisans at the time, Josip Broz Tito, would send two representatives by the names of Miladin Popovic and Dusan Magoza to unite the Albanian communist groups into a cohesive fighting force. This also led to the creation of the Communist Party of Albania, or the PKSH, on November 8, 1941. The two representatives had selected various Albanian communists to be on the Albanian Central Committee. Most importantly, the people that they chose were Enver Hoxha and Koci Zoze, who would later become Deputy Prime Minister of Albania after the war. Hoxha was picked by the two Yugoslav representatives in order to represent Albanian Muslims in southern Albania on the Central Committee of the PKSH. And more importantly, he would become the party's first secretary, which essentially means that he would become the leader of the PKSH. The fact that the Yugoslav communists had essentially made the Albanian Communist Party themselves meant that they held a lot of influence over it. The two representatives in particular also held most of the power in the party, with Popovic having the political power and Magoza having the military power. In terms of recruitment, the PKSH would look towards the working classes and peasant classes of Albania, and to encourage people to join the resistance, the PKSH would, quote, promise the land to, quote, those who tilled it. Hoxha would also write the call to the Albanian peasantry in July 1941, which would call on the Albanian people to support the Albanian resistance in any way they could. Among these tactics, Hoxha would encourage these people to not pay their taxes to the Albanian fascist government or the Italian government, and would also encourage the people to hoard their livestock and grain. The PKSH would also develop propaganda that advocated for a Balkan Federation. However, this was more so to ensure its own security, as Albania had land, and more importantly resources, that most of its neighbors had wanted, most important of which were oil and various minerals. The PKSH would also fund ideological and political education about communism, and more specifically about Marxism-Leninism theory, as well as doctrine. And more importantly, the PKSH and Enver Hoxha in particular would come to idolize Soviet-style communism at the time, which was Stalinism, and would also romanticize the Soviet struggle against the Nazis and apply it to their own struggle against the Italians. Also, in Hoxha's more personal life at the time, Hoxha would propose to his fiancée Nemije and would later marry her in 1945. Much like the Yugoslav resistance, the Albanian resistance would try to unite all resistance groups, no matter their ideology, under one banner. These ideologies would include things like communism, non-communism, and some nationalists. On the 16th of September 1942, all of these groups met in the Pezhej conference in order to discuss creating a united front. And on a more important note, the PKSH were the ones who called this meeting in the first place. This conference was mostly successful, with most of these groups agreeing to work together to fight off their Italian occupiers. In addition to this, the conference also saw the creation of the National Liberation Army. However, there were some groups that did not sign this agreement, one of these such groups being the Albanian Nationalists. The Albanian Nationalists had known what the PKSH were intending to do at the Pezhej conference, and refused to join the National Liberation Movement. Despite this, the PKSH would proclaim that they would fight with the Nationalists side by side against the Italians. And with more political maneuvering, Hoxha would include Abbas Kupi, who was a nationalist that held a more positive view of the communists, unlike his contemporaries, on the National Liberation Council in a tactical maneuver. This would lead to the PKSH having the most influence over the National Liberation Movement. Alongside the National Liberation Movement, the National Union, led by Mirat Farashi, had been resisting the Italian occupation since 1939. However, it was no secret that the National Union had recruited everyone except for communists and excluded them in particular. The National Union would call for the Albanian people to fight against the National Liberation Movement, and much like the Czechs in Yugoslavia would take the selective collaboration with the Italians and the puppet Albanian government in order to subvert the Communist Party. The National Union claimed to be fighting for an Albania that would follow Republican ideals and accused the National Liberation Movement of being a, quote, cloak for the Communist Party. Despite these differences, the National Liberation Movement and the National Union would begrudgingly fight together against the Italians until 1943. As Italy's defeat loomed closer and closer in early 1943, the fragile alliance between the National Liberation Movement and the National Union began to collapse. As part of its war against the National Liberation Movement, the National Union would lean more and more towards collaboration with the Italians. On March 15, 1943, an agreement was signed between Italian General Lorenzo Dalmazzo, who was the commander of the Italian occupation forces in Albania at the time, and Ali Keltsira, who was a representative of the Italian Union. This agreement boils down to the National Union officially acknowledging its collaboration with the Italians in order to fight the National Liberation Movement. This agreement also stipulated that the National Union would send soldiers to fight alongside the Italians in any battles against the National Liberation Movement. Despite this, in July 1943, the National Liberation Movement, at the behest of a British military mission which had arrived a few months earlier, would ask the National Union to stop its collaboration with the Italians. From August 1st to August 3rd of 1943, the National Liberation Movement and the National Union would meet in the Mukye Conference. The Mukye Agreement, which was signed at the Mukye Conference, consisted of representatives from not only the National Liberation Movement and the National Union, but also the Legality Movement, which was a resistance movement that fought for the restoration of the pre-annexation Albanian monarchy. The Mukye Agreement saw the National Union drop its collaboration with the Italians and ally with the National Liberation Movement against the Italians and the newly arrived Germans. Despite this agreement, there was a major issue with it. The agreement stated that the National Union and the National Liberation Movement would share power together and let the Albanian people decide who would rule after the war. As I stated previously, around this time, Germany would send more and more resources to Albania, as well as 6,000 troops. One reason was that the Germans, and the Albanian resistance as well, suspected that there was going to be an Allied invasion of the Balkans. The second reason was that the Germans wanted to create a quote-unquote neutral government in Albania that would be friendly to the Germans. The power-sharing agreement would lead Hoxha and the National Liberation Movement to tear up the Mukye Agreement in September 1943, just barely after the agreement was made. This would then lead the National Union to once again start collaborating, but this time they collaborated with the Germans. With the Mukye Agreement torn up, the National Liberation Movement began to conduct offensives against the National Union. And by September 8th, 1943, the vast majority of Italian forces that remained in Albania had capitulated, with even one Italian division defecting towards the National Liberation Movement. The capitulation of the Italian forces then subsequently led to a German invasion of Albania and the creation of the quote-unquote neutral state that they wanted. And the National Union would be recognized as the official government of Albania. Though the arrival of the Germans hadn't impacted the Albanian partisans and the National Liberation Movement too much at first, the Germans would conduct a winter offensive against the partisans in the winter of 1943 to 1944. During the Germans' winter offensive, they would inflict a massive amount of damage on the National Liberation Movement, which saw it nearly to be entirely eradicated. The Germans also inflicted much brutality on the population centers of central and southern Albania, where the National Liberation Movement drew most of its support from. However, in the spring of 1944, the National Liberation Army would launch a massive counterattack against both the German army as well as the National Union. This would result in the National Liberation Army taking most, if not all, of its previously lost territory. The same kind of brutal fighting that had been seen in the Germans' winter offensive was happening all throughout the summer of 1944, with the Germans and the National Union slowly losing more and more ground as time went on. Also around this time, the Communists and Enver Hoxha would start to consolidate their power over Albania by convening congresses about permanent and Berat. The October Berat Congress was the most important, as it outlined what the Communist agenda was, as well as their foreign policy. More specifically, they stated that they wanted to help fix the, quote, years of despotism and foreign domination that had plagued Albania during and before the Albanian occupation. As the war was wrapping up, the capital city of Albania, Tirana, was liberated by the National Liberation Army on the 7th of November, 1944. And the last German units would be defeated at Shoktor on November 29th, 1944, thus finally ending the occupation of Albania by foreign powers. On the same day as the Battle of Shoktor, Hoxha would give a speech in front of 50,000 people in Tirana, speaking about the new government and its foreign policy. In addition, he would declare November 28th to be Independence Day and November 29th to be Flag Day, and with that, Albania was finally free. Or was it? Before I get into Hoxha's dictatorship, I just want to go over what his ideology is. As I've stated previously, he was a communist, but more specifically, he was a Stalinist. Stalinism can be defined as a very repressive form of communism which advocates for rapid industrialization, a cult of personality around the head of the country, and the implementation of the, quote, socialism in one country doctrine, which states that a country should focus on building up communism itself rather than prioritizing the world revolution. And more importantly, it also violently opposed Titoism. Titoism is a more liberal and freer form of communism that prioritizes federalization and decentralization over more centralization policies, and this would be implemented in Yugoslavia. And in the later parts of Hoxha's rules, more specifically in the early to mid 70s, he would go on to form his own kind of communism called Hoxhaism. Hoxhaism is very similar to Stalinism, but essentially what it advocates for is the defending of Stalin's legacy and ideology, and basically said it was the only true form of communism, and literally every single other kind of communism were just revisionists. And this would later go on to cause Albania's international isolation. As I've stated previously, Hoxha was in awe of Stalin and would consider himself to be a Stalinist. And much like his idol, Hoxha would begin to purge members of the PKSH around this time, with most people that were purged just being ousted from the party instead of being shot. Hoxha would also pass laws such as the Agrarian Reform Law in August 1945, which would abolish private property all throughout Albania. And it was also during this time that the Yugoslavian government was trying to gain more control and influence over the PKSH and Albania as a whole by increasing their political and financial stake in Albania. The PKSH, which would then change its name to the PLA in 1948, and I will be referring to them as the PLA throughout the remainder of the video, and the Yugoslavians had somewhat cordial relations during this time, with the only significant issue between them being the status of Kosovo. The Yugoslavians have claimed Kosovo as part of their territory, as it was like that before the war, and the Albanian government claimed Kosovo as part of their country, as Kosovo is home to a majority Albanian population. It was also in regarding with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had only established relations with the PLA in November 1945, and had been sending only minor support to them. And it was also in either 1946 or 1947 that Stalin allegedly warned Hoxha that Tito was attempting to build a greater Yugoslavia by annexing Albania into Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union would then start sending more support to Albania following the Tito-Stalin split in spring of 1948, which would also see the relations between Albania and Yugoslavia decrease as Hoxha would choose to side with Stalin. Hoxha would then also begin to purge perceived Titoists within the Albanian government, with half of the Albanian Politburo being purged in August 1948. These people that were included the Deputy Prime Minister Zoza, as well as Pendi Christo Thernelro, and Nesti Kurenji. All four men, particularly Zoza, were accused on flimsy evidence of being Yugoslav agents. And in a 1962 CIA memo, it suspects that the Soviets had a major role in the purging of Zoza and the rest of the people that were purged in August 1948. And this suspicion was based on the fact that the Soviets had played similar roles in the purging of so-called Titoite politicians and other satellite states around this time. And Hoxha would continue with many purges similar to this one from 1948 until April 1952, with Hoxha himself claiming that around 6,000 people were purged from the PLA. And most of those people that had been purged had joined the PLA prior to spring of 1948 when the Tito-Stalin split occurred. It was getting back to foreign policy. Because Hoxha had decided to side with Stalin during the split, Albania and the USSR had a strong relationship. The Soviet Union had started to send more military assets to Albania, including and also built a naval base in Albania to have more access to the Mediterranean Sea. The Soviets would also bring Albania into the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, or CMAA. And the CMEA was a Soviet economic organization that was supposed to counter the Marshall Plan in Western Europe in 1949, which then would eventually become more of a international communist economic bloc led by the Soviet Union. And with the Soviet economic assistance, Hoxha would then undertake the two-year plan in 1949, which aimed to increase Albanian industry, and by 1951 the Soviets would be responsible for massively funding both the Albanian economy and its industrial projects. With Stalin's death in March 1953 and the ascension of Nikita Khrushchev as the head of the Soviet Union, relations between the two countries were immediately damaged. At first, Hoxha and Khrushchev somewhat cooperated, with Hoxha implementing some minor reforms that Khrushchev had asked him to do. These reforms included things like lowering grain quotas and relinquishing his positions as Minister of Foreign Affairs and as Minister of Defense. Hoxha had also reopened the relationship between Yugoslavia and Albania somewhat in December of 1953. And had signed a trade agreement later in May 17, 1955. Hoxha would also join the Warsaw Pact on May 14, 1955. Despite all these seemingly positive events, however, 1955 would also mark the beginning of the end of the relationship between the USSR and Albania. The first event would be Khrushchev and Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin's surprise visit to Yugoslavia in May 1955. This surprise visit worried Hoxha, as he feared that supposed Titoite figures might make their way back into the Albanian government. In 1956, two major events would occur that would help end the relationship. One, Khrushchev would denounce Stalin in a secret speech. However, he would also ask Hoxha to rehabilitate Zoja's image. Hoxha would then respond to these two things during the Third Congress of the Party of Labour of Albania by outright refusing to rehabilitate Zoja's image, and not outright stating it, but essentially saying he didn't agree with the de-Stalinization policies that Khrushchev had taken and outlined during the secret speech. As well, he disagreed with Khrushchev's ideas of supposed peaceful coexistence with the West. 1956 would also see Hoxha start to drift more and more towards Mao's China, as Hoxha and Mao agreed with Khrushchev being more of a revisionist and not a real communist. However, unlike China, Hoxha would agree with the actions that the Soviets had taken during the Hungarian Revolution in November 1956, as he blamed Tito for being the cause of the revolution. However, the Soviets, not wanting to break their relationship with the Yugoslavians, would discredit Hoxha's viewpoint. This, combined with further attempts by the Soviets to mend the relationship with Yugoslavia, would break down Albanian-Soviet relations even more. Another crack would form in February 1957, where Hoxha would make a speech that would defend Stalin's ideology and actions, but would also directly attack both the Yugoslavians and many of the policy changes that Khrushchev had implemented in the Soviet Union. As a result of this, the Soviet leadership would invite Hoxha to a meeting in Moscow in order to reconcile the cracks in their relationship. But it ended up really being another attempt by Khrushchev in asking Hoxha to rehabilitate or reinstate many Titoite politicians. Hoxha refused, which then led to Khrushchev outright accusing Hoxha of being a Stalinist. The November 1957 International Conference of the Communist and Workers' Parties would again see the relationship between the two countries decay even further. During the conference, Hoxha had partnered with the Chinese in drafting a statement which stated that revisionism was a threat to communism. And by this so-called revisionism, they really meant Khrushchev's reforms. 2 years later, in May of 1959, Khrushchev would make a visit to Albania in order to try and improve relations, but this didn't really have that much of a positive impact on the relationship. It wasn't really that positive because Khrushchev was disappointed in what he received as the backwardness in the Albanian economy. Hoxha had also distrusted Khrushchev because of the conflicts they had in the past 6 years. And then in the next year, in 1960, the sign of Soviet split occurred. At the start of the split, Hoxha had made it secret that he viewed Mao's position as correct, which only led to a further rift in the relationship between Albania and the USSR. In April 1960, Hoxha would sign a trade agreement with China, which would then lead the Soviets to cutting off their own trade agreement with Albania just a few days later. However, the final nail in the coffin for the Soviet and Albanian relationship would come in October 1961 in the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or CPSU. During the Congress, Khrushchev would call Albania a politically backward state. Alongside this, Khrushchev would criticize Hoxha for not reforming as much as the other countries in the Eastern Bloc, as well as the Albanian-Yugoslav relationship. Later in November and December of 1961, the Soviets would remove their diplomats and embassies from Albania. This would then formally end Albanian-Soviet relationships. After this, Hoxha would expel several pro-Soviet politicians and diplomats from the Albanian government, one such person being Koko Tashko, who had tried to prevent the split of Albania and the Soviet Union. Despite these events, Albania was still part of the Warsaw Pact, and Albania would stay in it for the next 7 years. Following the formal end of the Albanian-Soviet relations in late 1961, Albania would look towards China for a new alliance as well as for trade. China would start to send financial assistance to Albania as part of this new alliance, and in return for this, the Albanians would persistently ask the UN to have a vote that would make Communist China the legitimate Chinese government, as at the time the Chinese nationalist government on Taiwan was still the legitimate government. The Chinese financial aid that came with this agreement, unlike the Soviet aid before it, had no strings attached to it, but during this time Hoxha would still move towards economic self-sufficiency. Another reason why Hoxha turned towards Mao is that he and Mao both agreed that Khrushchev was a revisionist and was a threat to their power. In addition to this, Stalinism, which Hoxha had been following, and Maoism, what Mao had been following, are essentially very similar ideologies, the only difference really being the application of industrialization It would be in 1964 that the current Chinese premier Zhou Enlai would visit Albania, and both countries would sign the Sino-Albanian Joint Statement, which would be the basis of what the relationship between the two countries would be like. Essentially, to simplify it, it says that the two countries would help each other equally no matter the cost. However, during the 1960s, Hoxha would undertake several domestic, social, economic, and defense reforms, and by this I really mean he'd do like a couple good things, mainly just a lot of bad things. For social reforms, Hoxha would do several things. One, he would make advances in gender equality. He would do this by banning the ancient Code of Lecce. The Code of Lecce was a traditional set of rules that Albanian women had to follow, and these rules were very unequal towards women. And in fact, they were so unequal towards women that at one point Albania was considered one of, if not the most patriarchal countries in all of Europe. Women during this time also got more into the job market, with the number of women in the Albanian workplace rising as high as 46% by 1985. Along with this increase of women in the workplace, more women had access to education. This would raise from like 2% in the 1930s to above like 50% by 1985. However, also in 1967, Hoxha would formally ban all religion and would proclaim Albania to be the first atheist state. Economically, Hoxha had decreased Albanian economic dependency on foreign governments, which had been around 50% prior to the Albanian-Soviet split. From 1961 to 1965, Hoxha, with Chinese funding, attempted another 5-year plan, which planned to build 25 energy plants, but it eventually fell through. During this time period, Hoxha would also initiate his most famous defensive policy, and that policy was called bunkerization. Beginning in 1967, Hoxha started a policy that would go on to see around 173,000 bunkers be built all across Albania by 1985. The reason why he did this was because he was extremely paranoid at the prospects of invasion from either NATO-aligned Greece, the Warsaw Pact, or Yugoslavia. In addition to that, Hoxha formally withdrew Albania from the Warsaw Pact in 1968 as an act of protest against Leonid Brezhnev, who had replaced Khrushchev as head of the Soviet Union in 1964, a brutal crackdown of the Prague Spring in 1968. Also in 1968, Hoxha would ban travel outside of Albania for all Albanian citizens except for high-ranking officials in the government. Despite the good reforms, Albania still was not a good place to live. Not only was Hoxha extremely repressive to his own people, his bunkerization policy massively drained the already small Albanian economy. This would eventually be a major factor in the major decline of the Albanian economy throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Regarding Sino-Albanian relations, they remained strong throughout the 1960s into 1971. And much like their relationship with the Soviets, their relationship with China would also start to crumble. The event that would spark the beginning of the end of Sino-Albanian relations would be, at the time, U.S. President Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1971. The Chinese government accepting to have a dialogue with Nixon had greatly outraged Hoxha, who felt betrayed that his ally was opening up relations with what he saw as an imperialist power and talking to someone who he regarded as a rabid anti-communist. Hoxha and the PLA would send a letter to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which stated, quote, "We trust you will understand the reason for the delay in our reply. This was because your decision came as a surprise to us, and it was taken without any preliminary consultation between us on this question, so that we would be able to express and thrash out our opinions. This, we think, could have been useful, because preliminary consultations between close friends determined co-fighters against imperialism and revisionism are useful and necessary, and especially so when steps in which, in our opinion, have a major international effect and repercussions are taken. Considering the Communist Party of China as a sister party and our closest co-fighter, we have never hidden our views from it. That is why on this major problem which you put before us, we inform you that we consider your decision to receive Nixon in Beijing as incorrect and undesirable, and we do not approve or support it. It would also be our opinion that Nixon's announced visit to China will not be understood or approved of by the people's revolutionaries, the communists of different countries." End quote. The Chinese government would go on to respond to this letter by threatening to cut off all financial aid to Albania. Also in 1971, Communist China was legally recognized by the UN to be the legitimate government of China, which made China's relationship with Albania become less useful, as one of the main reasons for the relationship existing in the first place was no longer a factor. In 1972, Hoxha would believe that Mao's China was no longer the true socialist country that he thought it was. In 1974, Hoxha would accuse a man by the name of Bakir Balaku of attempting to overthrow him and being a Chinese spy, which really only goes to show the rift between the two countries, which would only get worse over the following years. Following the death of Mao in late 1976, a man named Hua Guofeng would become the leader of China. Guofeng intended to make Mao's Three Worlds Theory the official foreign policy that China would take, and in August 1977 would announce it to the world. The Three Worlds Theory is a Mao's geopolitical theory that stated that China should become allies with third world countries in order to become a superpower, essentially. To this announcement, Hoxha would call this policy diabolical, that was bent on China building a global hegemony much like the Soviet Union and the United States. Also in August 1977, Tito would make a visit to China and be accepted with open arms. Hoxha essentially went ballistic after this meeting, with him proclaiming that Albania was the only true Marxist-Leninist state in the world. Hoxha would later go on and state in reflections on China that, quote, the Chinese leaders are acting like the leaders of a quote-unquote great state. They think, quote, the Albanians fell out with the Soviet Union because they had us, and if they fall with us too, they will go back to the Soviets. Therefore, they say, either with us or the Soviets, it is all the same. The Albanians are done for. But to hell with them. We shall fight against all this trash because we are Albanian Marxist-Leninists, and our correct course should always triumph. Then the following year, on the 13th of July, 1978, the Chinese leadership officially cut off all financial aid to Albania, and as well as diplomatic relations, which would cause Albania to become internationally isolated. With China cutting off all relations with Albania in July 1978, Albania would have no major trading partners nor allies. And with the Chinese cutting off all relations, the Albanian economy would essentially become non-existent. As Albania had no trade partners that could really help them, combined with the bunkerization policy, would make Albania the poorest country in Europe. This major economic decline would also see the poor living standards in Albania drop even more. And much like the last two times that Albania had split off relations with other countries, Hoxha would purge anyone who was seen as pro-China. One of such people being Mehmed Shehu, the 23rd Prime Minister of Albania, and he was supposedly killed himself in 1981, but was later condemned as a traitor by Enver Hoxha. Shehu was likely killed by Hoxha as a result of him wanting Hoxha to maintain relations with China, as China, again, was the last major trading partner and ally that Albania had. And around this time, the Albanian government would put even more pressure on the Albanian people to be more self-reliant. And also with this, Hoxha would cultivate more nationalistic sentiments, by stating things like, quote, the only religion in Albania is Albanianism. And also, regarding Hoxha's health around this time, prior to the isolation, he had suffered a heart attack in 1973, and by the late 1970s had prevented him from effectively running the country. And due to this, he turned over much responsibility for actually running the country to Prime Minister Ramiz Alia. And with this, he'd also spend the last of his days, in his last years, just writing books and reflecting on his life and his rule, and his ideology, most importantly. Enver Hoxha would eventually meet his end on the 11th of April, 1985, at the age of 76. He died as a result of a cardiac arrest that was brought on by ventricular fibrillation, which is a disease that causes an irregular heartbeat. Prime Minister Ramiz Alia would become the official leader of Albania just 2 days after his death. Alia would oversee the gradual liberalization of Albania, which would culminate in the country's first free election in March of 1992, in which the Communist Party would lose power and the Party of Democracy take hold. Hoxha had left Albania in much the same way he found it, that being a poor country that saw little progress, if any at all. However, he did some good things. One, he did improve the literacy rates in Albania, which in the 1930s was just below 10%. And by his death in 1985, it was 95%. That, and combined with the more equal gender rights, well, it's not so bad, actually. Despite that, though, Hoxha's regime was responsible for the deaths of around 25,000 people, with double that being put into labor camps. And most of the people that were either persecuted or shot were political opponents that were either in the PLA or not in the PLA. Despite all the repression, though, Hoxha is still a very decisive figure in Albania, with many older Albanians believing that he had a more positive impact on Albania though just as many younger people hold the exact opposite opinion. And another major impact that Hoxha would leave on Albania was on Albanian culture. Hoxha's personal paranoia and feelings towards the West had meant that Albanian culture was centered around suspicion of outside culture and apathy. In 2023, Albania has grown since the collapse of communism. Albania has drifted more and more towards the West despite the culture change, and it even joined NATO in 2009. It has also clawed its way out of being the poorest country in Europe, though it's still one of the poorest. Albania, as of 2021, has an HDI score of 0.796, which means that it has a high human development. Overall, I wouldn't say, in my personal opinion, that Hoxha was a complete jackass, but he did have some irrational things, like the bunkers, primarily. But now you know, if you ever get asked to name any communist leaders, you can say Enver Hoxha.